Hello, everyone. Peter Mariavittoria here. I'm the events director at City Lights. On behalf of City Lights Booksellers and Publishers, I'd like to welcome you to session 2 of our weekend celebration of the life and work of Ann and Sasha Shulgin. This session is called Stories from the Edge, Trailblazers in Psychopharmacology. This event is being presented by City Lights in conjunction with Transform Press and Synergetic Press as we inaugurate the release of their wonderful new book, The Nature of Drugs, History, Pharmacology, and Social Impact, Volume 1. This is the first in a 2-volume set based on the lectures of the late Alexander Sasha Shulgin, recorded at San Francisco State University in the late 80s. Intended to be taught as an introductory course on drugs and biochemistry, this transcription is a unique document, being both an historic record of Alexander Shulgin's teaching style and the culmination of his philosophy on drugs, psychopharmacology, states of consciousness, and societal and individual freedoms related to the use of psychoactive substances. So as we begin this session, I would like to acknowledge that this event is being broadcast from the site of the ancestral homelands of the Muwekma Ohlone peoples. On the peninsula where I stand, 8 different dialects of their language were once spoken. It is with respect to those who came before us that I would like to begin our proceedings and offer a moment of silence to stand in recognition of the place we occupy. With that said, a special thanks goes out to our co-sponsors of this weekend's sessions. They are organizations that are at the forefront of pharmacological advocacy and research. A spirited thanks to the Beckley Foundation, California Institute of Integral Studies, Chacruna Institute for Psychedelic Plant Medicines, the Arrowwood Center, the Fireside Project, Lucid News, the McKenna Academy, the Multidisciplinary Association for Psychedelic Studies, MAPS, Psychedelic Sangha, Psychedelic Society of San Francisco, as well as that of the UK, Psychedelic Seminars, Psychedelic Today, and the Usona Institute. This weekend is also being sponsored by the City Lights Foundation, carrying on the legacy of our founder, the late Lawrence Ferlinghetti, by encouraging deep literacy and critical thinking through our various publications and programs. And of course, our program could not happen without the collective efforts of a great many. It would be difficult to list all of them here, but first and foremost, a huge debt goes out to Transform Press and Synergetic Press. I'd like to pay our respects to Ann Shulgin and Wendy Tucker for carrying on the legacy of Sasha's work. They're sitting on top of a massive repository of information, and such a huge, huge thanks to them for just bringing forth this amazing book, and can't wait till the next one comes. Also, a huge thank you goes out to Deborah Parrish Snyder, the co-owner and publisher of Synergetic Press. Synergetic Press is based in Santa Fe, New Mexico, and for over 35 years has been publishing unique and paradigm-shifting books on the environment, ethnobotany, psychedelics, consciousness, and cultural anthropology. Their collaboration with Transform Press is an excellent example of the wonderful kind of projects they have been engaging with. City Lights is honored to be working with them once again, as we've collaborated before on numerous events. A special thanks to Sandy Balin, Doug Reel, and Jasmine Verdi at Synergetic, also to Amanda Muller, who had the crucial role in production of Nature of Drugs. She did such an incredible job, and it is such a beautiful artifact, and totally does justice to the content of the book. So before we begin, I would like to let you know we can be posting links in the chat function of your Zoom dashboard with which you may purchase copies of The Nature of Drugs. For a limited time only, we have signed copies that Ann Shulgin was kind enough to inscribe for us. We're also selling copies of PCOL and TCOL, the 2 great formularies and magnum opuses of Ann and Sasha Shulgin's work. Those are still in print. Secondly, I'd like to let you know about a real treat that our friends at Ozo Conferencing have prepared for us for this occasion. It is a virtual environment that is based upon the Shulgins'. There's a kind of a hill up the way from their home where up to 40 people at a time may meet there is also a facsimile of the Shulgin laboratory that you can access. So you're going to need to familiarize yourself with the Ozo platform, and I think you'll need Google Chrome to access it, but it's so much fun. And, I think you'll have a really good time with it once you get in. So, and finally, we're going to be posting questions and comments in the chat function. So please use your Zoom dashboard if you have questions for everyone, and we can take them at the end of the panel. So our moderator for this session will be Dr. Mariavittoria Mangini. Dr. Mangini has been a family nurse midwife for 25 years. Her academic interest has been the historiography of psychedelics, and she has written extensively on the impact of psychedelic experiences in shaping the lives of her contemporaries. She is the director of the MSN FNP program at Holy Names College in Oakland. She has 31 years of experience in family practice and women's health, including 22 years with the primary care practice of Dr. Frank Lucido, one of the pioneers of medical cannabis movement. Her current project is the development of a thanatology program for the study of death and dying. Joining her will be Allan Badiner. He is the editor of the books Zigzag Zen, Buddhism and the Psychedelics. Also the book Dharma Gaya, A Harvest in Buddhism and Ecology, and the book Mindfulness in the Marketplace, Compassionate Responses to Consumerism. He is a contributing editor of Tricycle Magazine and serves on the board of directors of Project CBD. He has been a student of Zen Master Hityat Khan for more than 25 years. And joining them will be Erika Dyck. She is professor and a Canada Research Chair in the History of Health and Social Justice. Her interdisciplinary research brings social science and humanities perspectives to scientific and medical subjects. Her work has been published in medical, legal, economic, literary, philosophical, anthropological, and historical journals and outlets. She is the author of several books and also a board member of the Chacruna Institute for Psychedelic Plants and associate director of Chacruna Canada. Also on the panel is Dr. George Greer. Dr. Greer is a psychiatrist who has conducted extensive therapeutic sessions with MDMA, together with his wife, psychiatric nurse Requia Tolbert Greer. He is a co-founder and board chair of the Hefter Research Institute and has been the organization's medical director since 1998. Dr. Greer is a distinguished life fellow of the American Psychiatric Association and past president of the Psychiatric Medical Association of New Mexico. He was also the clinical director of mental health services for the New Mexico Corrections Department in the 90s. And joining them will be Dr. Dennis McKenna. Dr. McKenna is an ethnobotanist, author, and founder of the McKenna Academy of Natural Philosophy. He has conducted extensive ethnobotanical fieldwork in the Peruvian Amazon, and he is also a founding member of the Hefter Research Institute and was a key organizer and participant in the ayahuasca project, the first biomedical investigation of ayahuasca. From 2000 through 2017, he taught courses on the ethnopharmacology and plants and human affairs in the Center for Spirituality and Healing at the University of Minnesota. And also joining the session is Keeper Trout. He is an ethnobotanist, conservationist, curator of the Shulgin Archive Project, and one of the founders of the Cactus Conservation Institute. Keeper Trout has served as technical editor of the Entheogen Review for nearly a decade. He is presently collaborating with Transform Press and Synergetic Press, helping to bring additional material by Sasha Shulgin into print. So please welcome now Dr. Mariavittoria Mangini to moderate the session. Welcome.
Thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be here and listening to the list of organizations that have sponsored this meeting and looking at the chat to see the locations from which people are signing in. It's remarkable how prolific and universal and widespread this interest has become, considering the changes in my lifetime and the lifetime of most of the members of this panel. So we're at an important and pivotal historic moment, and I'm very happy to be able to bring all of these folks together for this occasion to talk about stories that we all have experienced and can share about the work of the Shulgins. And without going very much further to describe what's going to happen, let's have it happen. Dr. Greer, George Greer, an old friend, I think you have a story that I had hoped that you would tell about an experience that you had with Sasha directly.
Yes, so behind me is the laboratory of Sasha. And I want to start by saying that I first met Sasha in 1975 at Esalen at a Stan Grof workshop. And he gave a talk about his work and drugs. And I found him to be irritable, kind of depressed, just not a happy person. And I met him again in 1980 when I wanted to start using MDMA in my practice. And he was a different person. He was then with Ann Shulgin, and he was happy, really happy, pretty much all the time. And that I just noticed such an amazing change in him that I attribute to Ann, basically, because they were in love so much. The reason I contacted him, I found out I could legally give people MDMA if I made it myself as a doctor. So I called up Sasha and he said, yeah, come on over, we'll try it. And he said, yeah, let's do it. It's fine. And so we spent a day in this lab making MDMA. And I actually contributed to, I think what's called process chemistry, because we sat down and said, all right, the first thing we have to tear up these strips of aluminum into 1-inch squares, and we need about, 1,000 of them. So she started tearing one strip, another strip, and then each strip she'd tear into 1-inch squares one at a time. I said, I think there's another way to do this, like get 10 layers of aluminum foil and tear them all at once. And so it didn't take like 3 hours. It took like, 15 minutes. So I thought, wow, I figured something out that Sasha hadn't figured out before. That was really exciting. So we did it together, and I was holding stuff and pouring stuff, and he was holding and pouring stuff. And then there was some acetone involved. He said, well, you don't need to put your hands in acetone. Just my hands will go in the acetone because it's like dries your skin like nothing else. So that was very kind. And I haven't talked about this much, but so I made it, I made it, I compounded it, but the yield was not what we expected. So the next day he figured something out and did some more extraction and got all of it. And so that was just a really exciting, fun thing to do. So I had a legal supply of MDMA. People could take it openly. I could write about it, etc. The next thing I want to describe happened a few months later on the 4th of July, 1981, and they had a big 4th of July picnic at their house every year. And so a lot of people were there. I remember Ralph Metzner was there, a lot of people. And at one point, someone said, well, let's all go in the backyard. It's like, what's going on? And they had a surprise wedding. And the minister was Bob Sager, who was a DEA chemist at that time. And he and Sasha were very good friends. Sasha would do some analytic work for DEA. So, okay, DEA chemist, what kind of ceremony is this going to be? It was a beautiful Native American wedding ceremony. And just so sweet. And everyone was just, love, love, love. And that was, I've never been to a surprise wedding before. A couple of other smaller anecdotes. Around 2000, there was a conference on psychedelics in San Francisco, and we're at lunch and sitting there and just rambling and kind of being silly and talking about word games. And Sasha just suddenly says, Oedipus Rex Harrison's Ford. And I went like, what? Did you just make that up? And he just smiled. He wouldn't tell if he made that up on the spot or done it before. And he also had a favorite thing he would say to people who took psychedelics would come up with, big theories that they occurred to them on LSD, like, the beings from the Pleiades talked to me and they told me this is their plan for Earth. They're going to like help with climate and all this other stuff and this complex sort of theory about what's going to happen. And he had two responses to this kind of rap. One was, and the other one was, so, and they would just stop cold, which was his intent, just to get him to stop talking to him. Those are the main stories I want to tell, but he was just a very, obviously a genius person at what he did, but very just compassionate and loving person, and a healer person. I mean, a psychotherapy healer person. Just, he would give to his group and people and tell stories, giving people MDMA. And I remember one person said, I'm having trouble breathing, I'm having trouble breathing. And he said, well, okay, just, breathe, go with it, and all this. And the person remembered being smothered as a child by someone, family member, who was trying to kill him. And they held this whole post-traumatic, release over that. So he could do a lot of psychotherapeutic stuff. And of course, Ann was, I would say, therapy, compassion, connection in that way that's her specialty. So those are the stories I wanted to share with this group, and I'm happy to do it. And Maria, I'm not sure, did I leave out the specific story you wanted me to share?
No, but George, I think that there probably are people here who understand what the circumstances that brought you to Sasha's lab to make the MDMA in the first story that you told were. But I think there may be people who aren't aware that there was some regulatory stuff about why you had to be there to do it and to participate.
Well, yeah. So to go into more detail, I wanted to do it. I was giving ketamine in my practice, and I found out, you need whatever preparation for that. It was an approved drug, but I found an opinion by the California Attorney General from a few years before about this question: can a physician give a drug that's not approved by the FDA or the California Health Department? And his answer was a long thing. Yes, because physicians and pharmacists are regulated by their licenses, professional licenses. The health laws don't apply to them in terms of their practice, professional practice. So, I can't make a drug and give it to someone who gives it to someone else, because now I'm a drug company. But as a practitioner, I could do that. Like I can scrape the bark off the tree or give a plant to my patients. That's medical practice. People can sue me. I can have my license taken away. That's my regulation. So that was a loophole that I discovered that enabled me to do this, because I'm not an underground person. I wanted to do above ground, open, write about it, etc. So is that what you're talking about?
Yes.
That was the legal research I did. So that was a happy thing.
Yes, and I think that's a really classic Sasha Shulgin story about being able to find the edge and stay within the boundaries of what's available and acceptable. And I'm very grateful to you for telling us about that.
Yeah. Okay,
well,
thanks very much.
You're very welcome. Unfortunately, I think George is going to leave us now, so we're not going to get to have the question and answer with him. But if questions come up, I'll send them to you. Okay.
Thank you very much. Yeah, sorry, I have a family thing, but I'm really glad to be here.
Glad to have you. And then I'd like to call on Keeper Trout, who has been introduced by Peter already, and who, if you know him, needs no introduction. And I would be happy to hear, Trout, also a story that you have to tell us about Sasha and aspects of Sasha's life and personal history.
Sure. It sort of comes from where I'm sitting right now, which is Sasha's office. And I've always been interested in the appearance of DOM on the streets. It's been a point of personal satisfaction or personal fascination for years. And after noticing that Sasha had given several different accounts of it, I grew even more curious. And of course, the story of DOM being released and how it became STP has already been largely told a long time ago by Nick Sand at a MAPS conference. And the missing details were more recently filled in by Tim Scully. But to me, an even more curious question became apparent of why? Why would Sasha take such a great personal risk just to see DOM become available? If his role had been discovered, it would have ended his career and caused him lasting trouble. Plus, in this case, all fingers would be invariably pointing to him. I mean, this was, after all, a molecule that was unpublished. It was Dow's intellectual property, even if it was unpatented, and It was on record as having been invented by a former Dow employee, namely Sasha. For him to succeed, he would need not only to be able to weather all of those questions and produce a plausible alternative path, but he would also need to cover his tracks for the molecule itself, as Dow had reported that their inventory was still completely intact. In a Psychedelic Salon podcast, Tim Scully commented that Sasha was able to provide a reference sample of 50 grams to Owsley, along with an index card showing the basic steps. Obviously, the answer was likely known only to Sasha, but in the course of digitizing the archive, some possibilities arose. My present belief is Sasha highly valued DOM as a molecule that could be of benefit to medicine and therapeutic applications, and he didn't want to see it just vanish into obscurity. There may also be an element of sentiment, as his son Ted helped him in performing the first step in its first synthesis late at night at Dow on the 22nd of June, 1963, during a brief period of Ted's interest. As this led to the creation of what was then Sasha's most potent compound, it would not be surprising that this gave him a source of personal pleasure. More history about DOM itself might be helpful here. Sasha had invented two closely related compounds, DOM and DOET, that were presented to Dow as meriting study. They both impressed him greatly, even though he recorded sampling DOM only within a barely threshold dosage level during those early years. Sasha had completed the synthesis on November 9th in 1963, and he first tasted it at 3:22 the next afternoon when he took 100 micrograms, followed by another 100 micrograms 80 minutes later, and experienced no effect. On January 4th, he tried a milligram. And this hinted at activity, so he followed it 5 days later with 1.4 milligrams and described threshold effects. His friend and research collaborator, Tony Sargent, was the first person to take DOM up to a hallucinogenic level in February with 2.3 milligrams. And before long, another coworker reported the first full-blown psychedelic experience after ingesting 4.1 milligrams. Something that might not be apparent here is that Dow was already working with an unclear number of related phenethylamines prior to Sasha's arrival in 1956. Despite Sasha not ingesting mescaline until 1960, it's clear that Sasha first synthesized a significant amount of mescaline for Dow in 1958, and he had commented about his intention to do this as early as 1956. Sasha wrote a preliminary internal report for Dow about DOM in February of 65, in which he mentioned its effects in humans and its extreme potency. He hoped an IND would be submitted and urged Dow to patent both drugs. He became openly annoyed with them as he realized they were not planning to take any action on DOM and only planned to submit an IND for DOET. So early in 1966, 100 grams of DOET went off for toxicological study. In October, this was followed by 10 grams being sent to Johns Hopkins with plans for clinical studies, accompanied by 10 grams of DOM. At the same time, Dow assigned DOM an inactive status and dropped plans to do anything with it. Now, it's common for drug companies to make potential products that aren't developed further. But in this case, the primary reason for Dow's decision not to submit DOM appears to have been based on it showing clear, strong hallucinogenic activity in what few people sampled it at the highest reported levels. It was suspected by the core set of researchers, including Sasha, that DOET might well be just as hallucinogenic as DOM, maybe more so. So it began being presented in such a way that implied the opposite, and the dosage levels used in all human clinical trials were deliberately kept low. This was openly discussed as being necessary to protect the molecule for therapeutic applications long before the publicity storm that occurred after STP was distributed by Bayer in '67. So it would make sense that Sasha would similarly want to save DOM from a state of pharmacological oblivion. Being shelved prior to publication would not just stop further development by Dow, nothing more could be done with it by Sasha or anyone else. It was clear that Dow was losing interest in its development in '65, and it was made a fact in September of '66. Now, for reasons unrelated to this, Sasha submitted his notice to Dow in December and left at the end of the year. His Johns Hopkins lecture occurred the very next month, on January 25th of 1967. This was the lecture that Sasha later implied was where knowledge of the synthesis may have escaped into the public's hands. The Johns Hopkins talk and its content had been cleared with Dow's legal people, but the only published material on DOM was the internal literature of Dow. While an IND had been submitted for DOET, the psychiatry department at Johns Hopkins was aware of it and had begun preliminary work with both molecules after Solomon Snyder contacted Dow about this possibility in August. It was that IND that enabled the identification of STP when it appeared on the streets. A point was made in Tim Scully's archives that when STP's memorable free distribution occurred on the 21st of June in 1967, Tim was still in Denver. And although he was already able to synthesize DOM, he was still working on the details of its crystallization as the hydrochloride. So it was not yet in distribution. Sasha thought highly of Owsley, even if they wisely maintained distance. This is evident in the archives in what few spots give illumination. That the role played by Sasha in the appearance of STP in Golden Gate Park during summer solstice of 1967 successfully remained a secret for so many years, or was at most an unproven suspicion, indicates the strength of their mutual respect.
Remarkable story, Trout. Really true Sasha and fresh Trout for sure.
And he successfully did it. That's to me, that's the most amazing part, is against all odds, he succeeded.
That's the application of a remarkable brain to a complex problem with a very interesting and amusing solution. Thank you so much.
You probably can't notice it, but that's Owsley's picture over my right shoulder.
I do see that. Well, thank you. We'll come back to you in a bit, but I'm going to ask Dennis McKenna if he would be the next speaker.
Yes. Yes. Thank you, Maria. Thank you, Keeper, for such a wonderful story. As usual, you're a tough act to follow. I'm just flabbergasted at your memory for occasions, for specific dates, and I can see why you're the Shulgin archivist. You are a historian of psychedelics, of many other, in many other respects too. I still remember very fondly the talk that you gave at the Ethnopharmacologic Search for Psychoactive Drugs in 2017 that we organized, and actually Synergetic Press published those proceedings. And it was just an amazing story, an aspect of peyote that I never knew about before. So my own experience with Sasha, is a combination of both personal and professional interactions. I think I can honestly say that if it weren't for Sasha, I wouldn't have had a career in this area, in psychedelics, or ethnopharmacology. I'm trying to think when I first met him, and the earliest date that I can think of, I'm not as precise about it as Keeper is, but I believe it was when Jeremy Bigwood and I visited him in San Francisco at UCSF. He was spending some time, I think he was teaching a course, or he was there several afternoons a week. We had just published the Psilocybin Magic Mushroom Growers Guide. Jeremy Bigwood was the illustrator of that little pamphlet that's made such a difference in people's lives. And because we had published that, we were busily growing these mushrooms out of mason jars at our, what Terence used to call the Psilocylum, in Oakland. And we brought a few of these jars, fully fruiting, beautiful specimens of Stropharia cubensis, Psilocybe cubensis. At the time, we called it Stropharia cubensis, in a briefcase, or a small suitcase. We met Sasha in the cafeteria to have lunch, and Jeremy cracked this briefcase and showed him these 3 or 4 fruity jars. And Sasha said, well, I see you have the materials there. And then he was like a little nervous. He was like, what are these crazy hippies doing, coming into UCSF and with these controlled substances? I think he was a little nervous, but he didn't let on. But I think that was the first time that I met him. And then, so that would have been about 1975 or 76. And then in 1979, I started my thesis investigations at the University of British Columbia, and I was doing ethnobotany, pharmacology, and chemistry, primarily of ayahuasca. And my doctoral thesis involved, field work and then also laboratory work to complement that. And I asked Sasha to be the outside examiner on my doctoral work. And he very kindly agreed to do that. And so I did the work, and he reviewed the thesis and all that. And he was very kind about how interdisciplinary it was, and, what a great synthesis of these different disciplines it was. And because of his status, I got approved. I remember there was so I got my degree in 84. And at that time, they were holding these various seminars at Esalen. And I think the group was called the Arupa Group. And Sasha was very often there, and Terence was there. Terence was practically, at times he was a resident of Esalen. So me, with my newly minted PhD, went down to some of these Arupa groups, and I just completed my degree, and Sasha was there, and Terence was there, and Terence said, yeah, Sasha, just another bogus PhD, right? I should have punched him out at that point. I was really pissed that he said that, but being a mild-mannered person, I didn't, and I never really did call Terence out. Now, of course, it's too late. But anyway, Sasha didn't feel like it was a bogus PhD, and I certainly didn't. It took 5 years, and it was tricky to do. So as a result of that, that was my first professional sort of interaction with Sasha. But then after I finished my PhD, I became the world's, longest postdoc. I did 3 postdocs after my PhD. And the second one was at the Laboratory of Clinical Pharmacology at NIMH. I had applied for a fellowship program called the Pharmacology Research Associate Traineeship. And at the time that I went there, I started that in 1986. It was my second postdoc. And at the time, there was a lot of excitement about DOI and a lot of interest in mapping the serotonin receptors, and specifically the psychedelic, the hallucinogen receptors, as we called them. And it was beginning to emerge that the 5-HT2A receptors were involved in this somehow. And the laboratory that I happened to join, Dr. Juan Saavedra, was my supervisor. And I originally came, I was going to work on something related to ayahuasca. But when I got to the laboratory, what they were doing there was autoradiography, which at the time was a really hot, no pun intended, kind of very sexy way to map receptors in slices of brain, using radioactive ligands, right? Radioactively labeled drugs. One of Sasha's main contributions to the pharmacology of all this was the analogs of DOM that could be halogenated either with bromine or iodine, radioactive isotopes of these compounds, which could be used for a lot of things, including labeling these receptors. Well, when I got to the lab at NIMH, we determined to work on these, but we needed radioactively labeled DOI. We needed DOI labeled with iodine 125. Since I had a good relationship with Sasha, and since he was at the time working at the Lawrence Berkeley Laboratory 2 days a week or something with Tony Sargent and Chester Mathis was one of the other investigators. Thanks to them, they were able to synthesize these very hot, radioactively hot isomers. I had not just one, but both isomers of DOI. And with that, we were able to do this autoradiographic mapping of the serotonin receptors. And I remember, my supervisor, Juan Saavedra, was amazing in many ways, but he was difficult to work with. And one of the things that he did not like to do was collaborate. But in order to get these radioactive compounds, we had to get them from Berkeley and get them from the laboratory. And so when we published, he didn't want to include Sasha or any of the other people as co-authors on the papers that came out, So we had huge fights over this, because I insisted these people made the ligands. They have as much, we wouldn't be doing this work if it wasn't for them. And you pretty much have to include them or I'm out of here. So we had some conflicts, but eventually he gave in. And over the course of the next few years working with that compound, we published a number of papers and Sasha's name was on most of those. So then when I finished that postdoc, I started another postdoc, my third and final postdoc at Stanford. And that was 1988. And we moved back to the Bay Area from Bethesda. And I started at Stanford working with Stephen Perutka, who was maybe known to some of you. He was very big in the serotonin world. He was Mr. Serotonin, working on MDMA and MDMA neurotoxicity, among other things at that time. So I started a postdoc with him. The other thing that had happened at the end of my postdoc in Bethesda, 1988, was my daughter was born in May 1988. And about a month later, we moved out to California in the middle of a huge heat wave, found a place in Redwood City, and I started my postdoc. But then the Friday night dinners were a thing, then they were happening, and I knew Sasha. And so my wife and I were occasionally invited to go to these Friday night dinners, which we did. We didn't do every Friday night, nor were they held every Friday. But, a couple times a month, we would, after work, after I got back from my lab, we'd drive up there and have these Friday night dinners, which were wonderful occasions. And my wife did not believe in having a babysitter. So our baby, who was just a few weeks old at the time, went with us every place we went. And we went to these things, and it was just amazing how open, like sometimes people would resent if you bring an infant into a very adult party like this sort of thing. But the people there were so open and beautiful, and they just welcomed Caitlin literally with open arms. And I can remember some of the later parties when she was actually able to crawl around, her crawling around in this forest of adult legs, as we're all standing around having cocktails and so on. Everybody's aware of her, careful not to step on her and so on. And then when Sasha and Ann would notice her, they would just scoop her up in their arms and hold her, and she was delighted, and Sasha and Ann, in her mind, I mean, Sasha looks like Santa Claus, white hair, white beard, twinkly eyes, little glasses. And then Ann is just, the Earth Mother, very kind and obviously just a very warm person. So I think in Caitlin's mind, it was like this was Mr. and Mrs. Santa Claus as far as she was concerned. And they became, not in any formal sense, but kind of the default godparents of my daughter as a result of these Friday night dinners. And I'll always remember that. And there's much that I cherish about my professional interactions with Sasha and how kind he was to help advance my career. But what is closest to my heart really is how kind they were to our daughter, to me and my wife in these social situations. So that just demonstrated what stellar, wonderful people they are. And I just have fond memories. There were other interactions, but that's the one that sticks in my mind. And then, of course, in the Bay Area, we would see them at Hefter research receptions that Betsy Gordon used to organize. And such a sad occasion when Sasha passed on. But he's left a tremendous legacy and tremendous inspiration for so many of us. Thank you. You're muted.
Thank you. I had to wait for the host to unmute me. I'm sorry. That's a lovely story. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
That's lots of people have experienced the nurturance that both Sasha and Ann have provided for them, but that's a particular special kind.
Indeed.
Well, Allan, I believe you would be the next speaker. Would that be okay? Are you muted as well?
Allan, you need to unmute yourself.
Okay.
Oh, there you
I
go.
just asked.
Perfect.
Sorry. So it was 1984, and after almost a year of traveling in India, it was finally time to come home. India really did get under my skin. I love the music, the food, the people, and its history going back to King Ashoka. A wise friend convinced me that I needed to integrate my India experience before returning to the States. She suggested a very specific plan to meditate for a few weeks in an ancient monastery in the mountains of Sri Lanka called Rock Hill Hermitage. It sounded amazing, not to mention that spicy Sri Lankan food was also a favorite. A few days later, however, I realized that I couldn't have hated it more. My back and legs were in pain. From hours of sitting, I loathed the swarm of ants in my tiny cabin. I was sleeping on wood covered with burlap. Meals consisted of stewed greens at 6 a.m. and the same stewed greens at noon and no dinner. But the morning before I was scheduled to leave the monastery, I awakened to a state of absolute bliss. I even enjoyed watching the ants as I packed up my things. It felt like I was connecting visually from my heart with anyone or anything crossing my path. The resident monk gave me some letters to give to other monks back in America. I delivered a letter to a kind monk in Brooklyn, and then in LA to Venerable Dr. Havampa Rattanasara, a senior monk and dean of the College of Buddhist Studies. He was a small man with huge personality and infectious laugh. After giving him the letter, I bade him goodbye and began to turn and walk away. "Where are you going?" he asked. "Come and have some tea with me." I did, and then I left 3 years later. Studying Buddhism and the Pali language, I was intent on learning more about my state of mind when I left that monastery. I wanted so badly to be able to bring it back. In my book, Zigzag Zen, I focused on the relationship between Buddhism and psychedelics. I think it's fair to say that Buddhism is psychedelic or mind manifesting. Some pioneers of both psychedelics and Buddhism included Alan Watts, Ram Dass, Allen Ginsberg, Alex Gray. Oh, by the way, Alex Gray curated my book, Zigzag Zen, with beautiful art. Check that out if you haven't already. And Jack Kerouac, Ralph Metzner, Jack Cornfield, Joan Halifax, and others. My earlier books focused on Buddhism and ecology with Dharmagaya, and Buddhism and economics with Mindfulness in the Marketplace. So after a long time in India, I was enjoying a friend's party in LA with great city views, cool guests. She knew I wasn't into drugs, quote unquote. So I was surprised, but still trusting when she asked me to open my mouth and close my eyes. She called it X. I watched the view for a while, and then I noticed a woman also enjoying the city lights. I recognized her as someone I knew, but was not particularly fond of. However, I broke the silence, and we ended up in a nice conversation. Rather suddenly, we felt quite close, actually. I left the party with overflowing euphoria, a doggy bag of X, and strong interest in meeting Dr. Shulgin, who I understood to be the source. I caught up with him in his small office at San Francisco General Hospital, hoping to write a story about him for the LA Weekly. Tall as he was, he reminded me so much of the gurus in India. His smile was brilliant, and his silvery white hair just seemed to burst out of his head. He was amused by the comparison between him and the holy men in India and invited me to visit his farm, an amazing backyard, mad scientist-looking lab in Lafayette near his home. He told me about his journey adapting what was a potential yet untested appetite suppressant from Merck in pre-war Germany. In short order, MDMA was in underground use clinically as an adjunct to psychotherapy thanks to Sasha and Leo Zeff, the secret chief, and Myron Stolaroff, and others who were intrigued with the therapeutic value of these chemicals. Dr. Shulgin was a known genius in the lab, and his expert testimony in federal legal cases kept him from being a target so that he could continue to enjoy his private research. Sasha, as friends called him, was married to Ann Shulgin, who hosted wonderful Friday night dinners, which we've heard about already. What I found most compelling about Sasha was his kindness and the extraordinary quality of his attention. Sasha was more interested in learning the relationship of how substances interacted and less in dictated what people should or should not use. Sasha and Ann wrote 2 books together about the detailed chemistry of these new compounds. Thanks to Rick Doblin of MAPS, MDMA has been recognized the world over as a medicine. And finally, I found a way to bring back much of that amazing state of mind that I woke up with in Sri Lanka. Thank you, City Lights. Thank you, Sasha. Thank you, Ann. And thank everyone for listening.
Thank you, Allan. Lovely. This is such an enjoyable thing to do, to tell these kinds of yarns. And I'm so grateful that we have the opportunity to do this. But now I'm going to ask that Erika would, who is from another country, a somewhat different generation from the rest of us, but a person with a very acute eye Erika, I want to hear from you about what you think about all of this and what we've been talking about recently.
Well, thank you very much for having me. I'm honored as a Canadian to be able to participate in this meeting. It's really a privilege to hear everyone reflect on the lives of Ann and Sasha here. I have never had the privilege of meeting either of them. And for myself and for many people like me, I only get to know about them from their writings, from the archive, the amazing archive, from the incredible and beautiful book. And I'm very grateful to hear that there are more coming. And really from the memories that you all hold and the stories that you share. As you know, as a historian, I attempt to piece these things together. So although I'm not familiar personally with the Shulgins, I never got to attend a Friday night dinner. I have been a historian of psychedelics for the last 20 years. And what I wanted to share today was also something about the bravery and the real courage that it takes, I think, to share these stories and to talk about these things. And it may feel strange today for me to bring that up, but when I started my research, and now I'll see if I can get these dates lining up with some of the dates here. I started my PhD in 2001. And at that time, my work on psychedelics was considered by my history committee to be something of a bit of a joke, something of a bygone era, something that didn't work. And I had the privilege of interviewing some people about their psychedelic past. These were researchers involved in the early history, people like Humphrey Osmond, who coined the word psychedelics. And it was interesting to me the way that the stories were preserved, but also how difficult it was sometimes to encourage people to open up to tell these stories. Sometimes there were children or grandchildren who were very protective of the legacy of their parents or grandparents and their roles with psychedelics. So I think that it's fitting that we are hearing about the stories of the Shulgins that bravely charted some of these waters, but also for all of you bravely sharing the stories that you had as we walk through and think through the kind of quasi-legal territory in which psychedelics have existed in for some time. We should acknowledge that it's 50 years since Richard Nixon declared a war on drugs. And my quick math, at least by Canadian numbers, suggests that it's almost 70 years, and it's 2 years later in the United States, since the introduction of chlorpromazine, this antipsychotic medication that many people rejoiced in sort of launching a psychopharmacological revolution. And so at the one point when we have massive commercialization and the beginnings of huge growth in big pharma, we also have a war on drugs. I was really excited to start reading and learning chemistry as I read The Nature of Drugs. And it was really remarkable to me to hear to read in Sasha's words and to try to get some of his personality, the way that he saw through those lines very clearly. And I hear in the stories that you're telling as well, the ways in which he did not cast judgment on the sort of legal pronunciations, but he recognized the political and moral stakes in the context of a history of psychopharmacology, in a history of drugs and ethnobotany, and a whole rich diversity of disciplines that feed our cognitive lust, in Maria's words, our cognitive lust for how these drugs affect our bodies, our souls, and I will add to that, our memories. I loved how the book starts to get us to think about challenging that just say no, and I'll spell that with N-O, and begins to turn that to a just say no, K-N-O-W. I know this is something that comes through in the book a few times, but a way that it seems to really bring a vibrancy to the way that we learn about these drugs. And Sasha's words, and again, the way that he packages this information is so inviting, and it's so passionate and inspiring in a way that we begin to empower ourselves with knowledge that then can challenge some of the political decisions that we know have carved up this history. I want to just say something. I'm hoping Maria's keeping an eye on my time because I'm not. I want to say something about the dinners. Not that I ever attended a dinner, though I'd love to. But it strikes me in the many conversations I had with other psychedelic researchers, those who called themselves pioneers, some of whom did not or rather shied away from those terms. But dinners were a central feature in sharing knowledge and in being able to sort of save some space and have some candid conversations about things that didn't fit in a pharmaceutical trial or in a university project, or sometimes within a particular policy piece. Dinners seem to be a really foundational part of sharing knowledge and of maybe breaking bread together and being a little more relaxed, maybe even inviting some children into the mix to keep us all honest and humble. Dinners were such an important place. And over the last year or so, Maria knows this, I've been really fascinated by the women who've been not just preparing those dinners, which was often the case in the 1950s, 60s, 70s, and probably still today, but the way in which they also shared information across these lines. And I think, and I just want to finish by saying, I'm really excited to be here, as I said, privileged to be here. And I really want to just remind you to tell each other these stories, to continue the tradition of sharing stories that move outside published literature, that move beyond the things that get stored in traditional archives. Because what I've heard here in the last hour or so is the real stuff of what the Shulgins have done and where their contributions are. And I think there's a lot for new generations to learn about how to relate to one another and how to learn about drugs in a way that is curious and not fettered by, you know, the sort of politics of the war on drugs or the politics of discrimination that come along with that for drugs, their users, and also the various ways that people have encountered them or played with consciousness. I'll end there because I really am excited to hear about questions, but thank you once again. It's just a pleasure to be here.
Thank you so much, Erika. This is my accustomed delight in every conversation that I have with you, and I think you've raised some really excellent areas for us to talk. We're not in a position to accept questions directly from the audience, but we were encouraged to talk among ourselves. And there are also a few things that have appeared in the chat that I probably ought to raise that are specific questions that were that we could probably begin to have a dialogue among ourselves once those have been dealt with. Someone back there when you were talking, said that there was a lecture given historically where Sasha had said that there was a compound with 4+ critical activity, a chemical. And the questioner is asking, do you know what chemical that was in reference to?
No, I do not.
Oh, well, that's what I mean. It's easily dispatched question. The other question that's has probably got a simple answer is, Dennis, is your thesis available for people who want to read it?
My PhD
Your
thesis?
dissertation, that was the question, yeah.
No, it's not. Papers from it have been published, but not the whole thing. I mean, it's actually, if you publish the whole thing, it would be incredibly boring. But if you go to PubMed and you search on my name, the papers published from that will come up. And also, incidentally, the papers that I published when I was doing my postdoc at NIMH, and Sasha was on many of those papers as co-author. So that was an era of my life which I sort of flirted with the idea of going into neuroscience. But I'm basically a botanist. I'm a plant guy. I'm a natural products guy. So it was great to be able to go to NIMH and spend that 2 years, and then the subsequent 2 years with Steve Peruka in the lab at Stanford. But it was kind of a departure from what I'd been doing before and what I ended up doing after that, which was more related to the natural psychedelics.
I think this group of speakers really represents a very interesting spectrum, because you're an ethnobotanist, Erika's an historian, Allan has described his personal history, and Peter described his history of his publications by and involving Buddhist practice and spiritual practice, and Trout, your extraordinary relationship to the archive and to Sasha's work, and plus the work that you've done yourselves. What an interesting mixture. I want to try to introduce an element of something that might be common to all of those things. And this was brought up in the part of the book that I participated in that's being discussed today, which is the idea about how much of Sasha's work could be really understood to be alchemical. And to what extent did he identify himself as an alchemist, and how does the quest for the quintessence that occurs in classical alchemy manifest itself in Sasha's work and in the the ways in which your work has interdigitated with his work. And I would be interested to hear if any of you has anything to say about that.
Well, I could make a short comment on it.
Oh,
I would say
please.
the core of it, because alchemy has always been about inner transformation, and the outer workings are for focusing on inner development. And Sasha spoke of himself in those terms many times. So I would say that's actually at the core of it. It's just misunderstood as being about, transformation of elements rather than transformation of one's being.
Thank you, Trout. I completely subscribe to that perspective, but I wonder if any of these other distinguished speakers has anything to tell us about alchemy and Sasha and chemistry and psychoactive substances. My understanding of alchemy is pretty rudimentary because I'm not a bench scientist at any level, but I have heard it said that alchemists often tried to protect their work from being too well known because they were concerned that it might be weaponized. And I wondered if that actually resonates with any of the things that any of you has been talking about the need for maybe, if not necessarily secrecy, but a certain kind of caution, prudence about revealing things to people that they might not be really ready to hear or to use.
I would agree with that.
Yeah.
A little on that as well. Oh, sorry, go ahead.
Well, let's do one at a time. Allan, would you like to make a comment about that?
Sure, I totally agree. I think still it's very important. There's a very important role for talking about these things, because no authority can be everywhere and arrest everyone for a slip of a remark or this or that, or a mention of something. There's no way to stop it, and nor would you want to. And part of the understanding of these things is to be able to talk about them in ways that people are understanding, and this is a very important function of these things, the alchemical process of these things becoming known to people. So I think with caution, it's par for the course.
I could say a word or two about that. I'd like
Please
to. Well, yeah. I mean, those of you familiar with Jungian psychology will probably be aware of Jung's book called Psychology and Alchemy, in which he discussed alchemy was people mucking around with chemistry. Basically, they were doing chemistry, but it was a reflection of an internal process. It was an externalization into the world of a process of self-transformation and spiritual evolution that was projected onto matter. That was Jung's understanding of what alchemy was, and I think he was right. But I'm sure that for Sasha, to work with these molecules was a form of, it was a spiritual practice for him. I think he's even spoken of it as a kind of performance art or as music. He was also an excellent musician. And he would talk about how, making molecules is not unlike composing music. You can put these different elements together and come up with something beautiful. And he had, we often distinguish between, sometimes in the psychedelic conversation, people distinguish between plants and synthetics, right? It's like, oh, the plants are better because they have souls, they're living things, and that makes them somehow superior. But to Sasha, his molecules were like his children, and he used to speak of their little drug souls, that he could make these things that actually had, a kind of aura of personality about them. They did to him. And then because his structures and ideas, not necessarily the substances themselves, but the structures got out, and other people were able to discover that as well. As far as the weaponization of psychedelics, I think that's just something that's inherent in technology. All technologies can be misused, and I often say in my lecture, there's no such thing as a bad drug, but there are plenty of bad ways to use drugs, and that's the key difference, but Sasha, he made these compounds as a gift to the world, and it was curiosity and a desire to explore the outer fringes of consciousness. That was really what motivated him to do these things. And I think that his work in this area was worthy of Nobel Prize, but because it was hidden and sometimes forbidden work, there was never a chance of that. But I think that in a more enlightened age, it would be realized that the tools that he created in the form of these compounds, these many compounds, would really have important bearings on the understanding of the brain-mind problem,
Yes,
which is still the huge holy grail in neuroscience, and these molecular probes were a way to look at that from the subjective point of view. So,
well, let's not forget that the Nobel Prize actually came from weapons also. But
there you go. Yeah.
So maybe it's just a good thing that they didn't notice Sasha anywhere along the road. This is a big topic, and I want to give Erika a chance to speak also, who also wanted to make a comment. We can certainly come back to this in a moment, and talk about it among ourselves. But Erika, would you want to make your
Sure.
observation?
Sure. I have to note the tremendous amount of hesitation I have, or, it's intimidating speaking with all of you about some of these topics, and as you've lived and, really done so much of the legwork and bench work here. But interestingly, the way that women have talked about ergot, for example, and the risk of talking about it or knowing about it, that put them at risk of, you can go back to the Middle Ages and say they were accused of being witches, and you can fast forward into other periods and say they were accused of being midwives, which was illegal. And you can move through the different stages where sometimes this information wasn't weaponized in the way that we might think of turning it into nuclear bombs or something, but weaponized in terms of criminalizing those users. And the other piece to that, I think, which bears mentioning, is the ways in which sometimes Indigenous plant knowledge has been sort of not just taken away, but actually used and over-harvested and usurped into other, mostly pharmaceutical means. And I know in the Pacific Northwest, this has been a real issue about not wanting to share knowledge. The Stolo community has not wanted to share compendiums of Indigenous knowledge of certain plants because of the over-harvest of rare trees that bear a real sacred value in the community. And I think there's a different way of thinking about weaponization in that context, in the ways in which it imperils communities. And I'm sure there are many, many other examples. I think of Maria Sabina's life and her contributions as well, and how sometimes sacred knowledge or maintaining knowledge in secret ways has actually been a way of protecting that. That was my comment.
Well, secret knowledge, yes, for certain. I also want to bring up too the sort of common construct of what gives the character to any individual drug experience that we all know, which is of drug set and setting. And then I want to just mention how really distinctively different the set and setting in which experiences that took place, particularly while the Shulgins were developing these chemicals and coming to understand them, when the environment was so hostile and the activities involved were so frankly criminal, and how that overarching level of social recrimination could have impacted the kind of places that people would go in their unusual states and explorations, and how very much that has changed since the last century. And I do think that's a very important thing for us to take note of, because there are so many people who are entering this space now when it is so much less dangerous and less discreditable to talk about an interest in this area or experience in this area than it has been for most of my life. And I think that's true for most of the other people who are speaking here today. um, I'm wondering if anybody has an observation related to that, about the change in the way that the social environment looks at this kind of experience. I think that has been brought up earlier today, that we talked about the many really wonderful parties that we've all attended at the Shulgins, and I think the chief problem that was generated by those parties, and to the extent that there ever was a problem, was where to put all the people's cars that came, because there were so many people who really wanted to participate. And the way in which mysterious and wonderful things can in some ways lose their aura of sacredness and mystery as they become bigger and bigger. And we're sort of in the process of having that happen now in relation to psychedelics. So I've said what I have to say about that. What about the rest of you all? Oh.
Well, I can speak to it. I think you make a good point. This, that for a long time, like so many traditions involving the use of sacred substances, whether natural or synthetic or whatever, it's been regarded as forbidden knowledge, or at least esoteric knowledge, and now we're seeing that much of this esoteric knowledge is being opened up. I'm not sure that's a totally good thing, but that is the nature of the internet and so on, that a lot of this information is now opening up. But there was a reason why this was considered not only sacred, but also, esoteric and potentially dangerous knowledge, which it is. I mean, the science of psychedelics is a dangerous science. It's not that the drugs are particularly dangerous. Used with reasonable care and forethought and knowledge and so on, these drugs are a remarkably safe class of compounds considering their powerful effects, but they are dangerous in the sense that they give you dangerous ideas. And that was the reason that they had to be suppressed by the war on drugs. It's not that the government cared. They didn't care, obviously, whether these compounds might harm somebody. You yourself, Maria, are the chronicler of the history of LSD and the misinformation and lies that surrounded LSD for so many decades. This was just pure nonsense, and anything, and it was just a propaganda campaign and designed to suppress people using these things to learn how to think for themselves. And that, in that sense, the psychedelics were tremendously empowering for individuals. So Sasha's work, it, in a sense, was forbidden science. Even though he had a DEA license, he had kind of made a pact with the devil so that they gave him a license so they'd leave him alone. Eventually, that didn't last, but because of that, he was able to do this work. And if you're working in an area of science that is effectively forbidden, you're probably working in the right area.
I love that notion of forbidden science. And I wonder, somehow that seems to be something that you might have something to say about, Trout. And I wonder if you would, if you have a comment to make about that, or you'd like to think about whether you'd like to make one.
Well, I mean, Dennis made really good points.
Yep.
And there are reasons that this is good to not broadcast and draw in everybody possible, because not everybody is suited for the experience. Some people are really fragile emotionally and psychologically and can actually be left injured and harmed afterwards, not physically, but, in terms of recovery. And so, this sort of pop science that's developing around psychedelics right now, where all you've got to do is turn around and you find another person referring to themselves as, quote, the shaman, unquote, is really disturbing, because it takes serious things very lightly. And things that are sacred is actually serious business. And not, it's not like watching Saturday morning cartoons. And that's how a lot of people seem to be approaching it. And I'm not I sound like I'm passing judgment on them, but I have no idea what's right for them. It just makes me uncomfortable.
Well, Allan, I know that you have an extensive background in some disciplines where there are clearly teachings that are not offered to everyone. And I wonder if you had something to say about this too. And, you've drawn an important parallel between the access to certain kinds of realms of understanding and knowledge and consciousness and Buddhist practice. And I wonder if you would speak about this also.
Well, I'm not sure what you're expecting me to speak to specifically.
Well, I'm thinking that in teaching some kinds of consciousness discipline, where people are expected to go to a place that's distinctly different from the one that they spend their ordinary day in. Not all of the tools with which to go there are given to everybody all at once. And there's some succession of provision of information or practices that has to do with what the person is able to realistically digest. You should correct me if I'm wrong, but I think that's what I'm talking about.
Well, sure, to some extent, absolutely. People are not communicating effectively if they're not taking that into account, because much of what could be useful with more background and more careful approach to it goes wasted in a sense, or it doesn't get told at all. And so, what you're saying is absolutely true. What I can say about it, however, I'm not sure. In addition to that, I'm not. Even though it's practical, and in many cases it's a question of effectiveness and being competent with sharing technologies like this, like Buddhism, like psychedelics for that matter, it's science, but it's not scientifically done. So there is a science to it, but it's not. It doesn't perform as expected all the time. Actually, I would go further than that and say, yeah, go ahead.
No, finish, please.
No, I'm done on that.
There's we're getting actually some really excellent questions, but I think that one of the things that I really cherish and recognize about the experience that we've all had with both Sasha and Ann is that they have been co-equal partners in their development of the network of knowledge that they are responsible for propagating in the community, each having a particular skill to bring to the work and a particular kind of way of communicating that which was learned. But I think Erika was making reference to some information that she's had access to because of studying some of the early history of psychedelics in Canada, where the partnerships were not co-equal in the sense that the women's contribution was not publicly acknowledged. And that didn't actually mean that it wasn't vital. It just wasn't, people didn't appear as the authors of papers or, get advancement in the university because of what they had contributed. And I'm wondering also if you see that kind of asymmetry has an effect on the way that this knowledge manifests in the community or develops its useful side. And if any of you would like to say something about that. Where are the women?
That's a good question.
Yeah.
Because if you look back, like if you go back into the 60s, like around Owsley, and you look at the news reports of him getting busted, Melissa Cargill's name is right there, front and center, as the person who taught Owsley how to make acid. But when you hear it repeated in history, she somehow just sort of gets dropped out of the picture, and it's the men whose names get repeated and remembered. And Melissa Cargill hardly gets mentioned, even though In every news account of the day, she was right there as the person with the knowledge. And I find that really
Good point.
She's unfortunately made
Yeah,
to seem
good.
like rather a lightweight, like many accounts of what happened during that time say she basically gave up her plans for graduate study and changed her social life so as to be able to be an associate of this fascinating man, which I can certainly understand the impulse to do something like that, but I think she's never acknowledged for the fact that she had the technique that that she had acquired in a formal kind of environment, which Owsley never ever had any of that kind of training, except that he got it from her. And I think there are a number of women who have filled that that kind of a role. I see that Dave Nichols has made a comment about Betty Eisner's contribution to LSD therapy, which, I just want to cite one particular thing of Betty's work that I'm extremely fond of, and that is a paper that she wrote sort of toward the end of her career as a scholar, in which she talked about the thing that I was just referring to when I talked about drug set and setting as determinative factors for people's experiences, because she identified the existence of the fourth factor, which I think is the one that's mostly in play right now, which is what she called matrix. And matrix was as she understood it, was the social environment from which people come to the experience and to which they return after the experience. And when you look at the so to say psychedelic renaissance, that matrix is the thing which has really changed. It's changed in the last 5 years, it's changed in the last 10 years, it's changed in the last 20 years, it's changed in the last century. And she was one of the first people to really identify that that was something that we were going to have to deal with. I also see a number of notable women in psychedelics whose names are being mentioned in the chat, and thank you very much for bringing them all here, and also for the citation, Erika, of the Chacruna site that shows, I think that they're getting now close to 50 posts about individual women in psychedelics. Erika has put up the URL for a piece that she and I collaborated on about Susie Ramstein, who was the first psychedelic guide and the first woman to take psychedelics, first woman to take LSD. She was the laboratory assistant of Dr. Hoffman, and the person who accompanied him when he had his first really startling experience with what he thought was going to be a minuscule dose and turned out to be a fully psychedelic dose of 250 micrograms. But, Susie Ramstein also, rather than that one post, which has just gone up in Chacruna just in the last couple of weeks, she's known, she's been in a sort of MAGA comic story about the bicycle ride. And she also is a factor in a novel by T.C. Boyle, which talks about the early days of LSD discovery and exploration. And in both of those cases, she's not really given credit for the contribution that she made as a trained laboratorian and as a guide therapist. She's kind of hypersexualized, and the drawings of her are a little bit buxom. And I think this happens a lot. And I think that's kind of what you're talking about with Melissa Cargill. She was the girlfriend. And in fact, she was the chemistry teacher. So forgive me my rant.
Rita, can I say a word about this too?
Please do.
I'll just continue your rant. The series has actually been really amazing. We put out a call for papers, and now we've got almost 50 posts, and they mostly are about individuals, but we're trying to take some liberties also in drawing attention to kind of gendered experiences. So sometimes in unnamed ways, when it's difficult to sort of pinpoint a particular individual's contribution, but it's clear that they're there. We find this in like the use of passive voice in reports where like the hand of God changed the music, but we know it was, Rita Hubbard. And there are ways in which we've been sort of piecing things together to find out the way that girls, and I use the term advisedly here because that's what the newspaper did, when girls were caught in Yorkville and Toronto's Hippieville, what happened to them as opposed to the men who were riding motorcycles and they were tough. So there's this really interesting kind of conversation going on. I couldn't keep up with the post there, but there's a post about Thelma Moss, Constance Newland. There's another one about Maria Sabina. There are a variety of there. I've seen a few of the names coming up. So I encourage you to go check it out. And if you have ideas, reach out. We'd love to post more.
Thank you. I would encourage you all to look at these names in the chat. Yes, Dennis, did you want to say something?
Well, I just want to say historically, it's just been the case that women have made major contributions to these areas in science, anthropology, ethnography, almost any field you can name. And they've been marginalized, and ignored. I mean, I think this new book that came out recently, The Immortality Key by Brian Mararescu, he is a scholar in classics research, talking about the historical roots of the mystery schools of Eleusis and Dionysus, and even the Christian Eucharist. And, these things, clearly there were psychoactive substances used, but the context, these were women-led institutions. I mean, the priestesses were, they were the ones, and then they were the ones that were doing this, but their role was sort of largely suppressed, especially in the Catholic Church. After the 1st century AD, the men kind of took it over and said, well, and the women that were actually keeping the tradition alive were then stigmatized as witches or otherwise, sinister figures. So I don't know, Erika probably is quite familiar with that, but it's just the historical case that, women are marginalized in these areas. Look at what happened, for example, to Maria Sabina. I mean, if it weren't for Maria Sabina, R. Gordon Wasson would never have gotten famous, and maybe the world would not have discovered mushrooms, at least not in that way. But her life was destroyed, and that's very sad.
Well, y'all know that this is my favorite subject, and we're all doing our best to change that history of that kind of marginalization. And I think some of the organizational work that's been done by pioneers in the Renaissance of this area of interest is really, look at the masthead for MAPS. There are a fair number of women in powerful positions in MAPS. Arrowwood has been, there's a co-equal partnership there between Earth and Fire and other women. Sylvia Tisson and other people that I very much admire have been very instrumental in getting the wonderful work that Arrowwood does and the reputation that it justifiably has out there in the community. So we're making progress here. And I'm actually going to change the subject, if that's all right with you, because there's a wonderful question here that, Trout, I'd like to ask you. Do you have a particular favorite find while you've been working in the archive that would give us some insight into Sasha? Like, is there something that you've noted or noticed, a document or a mention of a particular substance or something of that kind?
Well, I was rather struck by this rant that's never been published, and I hope will be in an anthology coming up someday. And it was basically sort of a slam against all of Sasha's friends and fellow researchers from early on who had stopped tripping. And it was basically the question, why am I the only one still standing? Yeah, because I'm not going to mention names, but he had a very famous psychiatrist and fellow researcher come up to him and say, isn't it a shame that we can't experience LSD anymore? And I thought Sasha really summarized that well in his response.
Well, Tim Leary used to say, take acid now while it still works. There's some really interesting and important things coming up in here. Names of women whose accomplishments are very, I think, probably well known to a lot of the audience for this talk, but there is actually one that may not be quite so well known, and that's Tonya Manning, who is actually a part of the Shulgin household, has been for years, along with her husband, Greg, and who has taken a tremendous amount of responsibility for, when Bob Jesse was talking this morning about how before the pandemic, there was always a really rich and wonderful salon that was going on at the Shulgin's house, where those of us who didn't live there could come and experience their hospitality and wisdom and counsel. And I have to really thank Tonya for having provided the opportunity for a lot of us to access that and to appreciate the way in which her support, I believe, has really made Sasha's life and now Ann's life much pleasanter and richer and more comfortable. And so I want to particularly take the opportunity to really thank you, Tonya, for doing that so that we could all have access to I've had a certain amount of experience in Native American communities because I worked for a foundation where I was a funder for those communities. So I got invited into a lot of settings where I might not otherwise have been welcome. And I do know that there's a habit that people have that you never pray for yourself first. You pray for the elders in your community, that their old age would not be a burden to them, so that they would stick around with you to be able to give their teachings. And you pray for your community before you pray for yourself. And I think the kind of activity that women like Tonya and other women that Erika has been referencing and the people in the chat have been referencing have accomplished in relation to the people who are more well noticed and more celebrated for the contributions that they've made is really sustaining and vital. And traditional behaviors have value. Traditional behaviors become traditional because they have value. And that habit of attending to your elders in that way is really a traditional behavior that I think we have to honor. So I'm glad to be able to do that. I'm talking a lot, but I'm going to talk some more. There is also some conversation going on in the chat about a book about women in psychedelics. I think the notion of women in psychedelics being a rich subject for exploration is really dawning on a lot of people. I think there are a few podcasts about this subject. Some of them are more about the outlaw end of the picture. Some of them more about the research end, and some of them people who are not so familiar at all, like Erika made reference to Rita Hubbard being the unseen hand that changed the records. And if you think we don't know anything about her more famous partner, Al Hubbard, we know a lot about him by comparison to what we know about Rita. So I would encourage everybody who's listening and looking at the chat to download the chat. You should be able to save the chat, including any direct personal messages that were directed to you individually. At the end of the session here, there's a little there should be a little box down there at the end where you should be able to save the chat at the bottom of the chat window. And I hope that you'll be able to do that, because there are wonderful references in here. So I think that's quite enough of me. I wonder if any of you August gentlemen has anything to say about this question about the missing history of the women in this movement.
I look forward to seeing it in publication and accessible, because it's something that, all of us have actually been talking about for the last few years, but we seem to be talking about it. And I don't really see all that much coming out. And somebody had mentioned, how wonderful it would be for an anthology to happen of all of the names who'd been listed before that. And I look forward to that. It would be a wonderful thing to actually become real.
Well, I thank you, Trout. I agree. There do exist two books that focused on the extraordinary stories about women and drugs, both by Cindy Palmer and Michael Horowitz. One is called Shaman Woman, Mainline Lady, and the other one is called Sisters of the Extreme. And a lot of these stories that's exactly what they've done in those books, is they've laid down the stories of women that were not generally known. if it's not a little too much self-dealing, I'm going to say I'm going to teach a class in women in psychedelics this fall. So I'm very interested in this topic, and those of you who have contributions to suggest about what would be good to cover or how to cover it, I'd be interested to hear from you about that.
Well, in my experience, surely women are given short shrift for what they provide and what they offer and their roles and what they've produced. But that's true in so many other areas as well for women. It's always more of a struggle than it should be. But what I have seen lately is, and this is a different area, which some people would say women are perfect for, but nevertheless, at least it's true that there are increasing numbers of women who are guides on psychedelic journeys. That's good because they are better at it. And it's not that they're better at that and nothing else. It's just that they have a talent with what's needed to put people in a state of a lesser agitation and more opening for themselves and for others to see who they are, to see them in a true light. And yeah, I mean, I think that's my assessment when I think about who are some of these terrific people who are guiding people, and all the best ones that I know are women. So
I think inherently women have more empathy, you know, and I think it's built into the biology of the situation, because the women are the ones that have the children, and you have to have a certain empathy in order to undertake that nurturing role. And it's the same kind of role that's called for in these intense therapeutic situations, you know. So I hope it's not, you know, I mean, I hope we never do reach a point where, you know, men can have children, because men are not suited to have children.
Well,
you know, they're just not.
I will observe one thing.
Speak for yourself, Dennis.
What's that?
Speak for yourself.
For yourself.
Allan says.
Well, and I can pretty much speak for all men here. I think it would be a terrible travesty, and I think it would produce a lot of really fucked up children. Not that there aren't plenty of them anyway, but it's not a failing of wisdom, women. It's a failing of human nature.
I would just like to bring up one little item of statistical data that might be interesting in relation to this, which is that, do you know what I'm talking about when I say toilet words? It's like what you use for your bodily functions when you're toilet training your child, or what the ones that children learn at home. The historically and anthropologically, they've been passed down in the female line. So most of the time in our country and in English-speaking countries and in lots of European countries, children learn the toilet words that are the ones that their mother and their grandmother used, and that's increasingly changing. And toilet words are now more mixed because more men are taking more nurturing roles in relation to the upbringing of their small children. And so I think that is just a granular piece of evidence that these things are subject to change, and that we can always reserve the right to do better and get smarter. And I'd like to think that we're doing that. Something else that came up in the chat that I particularly wanted to call attention to, having omitted, which is the fact that Tonya, whom I described as the sort of nurturing caretaker and Pearl Mesta of the hip set and historic hostess and household manager, also was Sasha's lab assistant during his life. And that was a significant omission on my part. So I want to put that in there on the list of her accomplishments. So, so as not to leave that out.
Can I add on something?
You certainly can.
Okay.
I have two things. One, Dennis, I just want to, I'm going to be a historian for a second, or well, forever. in the 1970s, amidst like concerns of the neo-Malthusian concerns, the need to control populations, one of the ad campaigns throughout North America was promoting men having children, because the suggestion was they'd only have one. So
And they'd probably kill that one, right? So.
A good thing ad campaigners thought of this too. But the other thing, I just wanted to make this point about women in psychedelics, but also bring it into a kind of science history a little bit. I think the point about guides is really critical. We recognize the importance of guides. We recognize the importance of a kind of tactile environment and an environment that is deliberately constructed. But in the 1950s, as psychedelics were being explored in a very systematic way, so were randomized controlled trials introduced. And that trial environment did not allow for measuring hand-holding or measuring the effects of music. There's a study, 1962, there's a study out of the University of Toronto, which argues that psychedelics are not effective because we don't know if it's just the use of attractive nurses and nice music. These are confounding effects. And the study was important in the sense that it convinced, at that time, Health Canada to pull back on its funding from psychedelics. So I think there's both a component about not recognizing women in their perhaps essentialized qualities. I'm not even going to get into that so much, but I would argue that there was a scientific reason why some of these features were not talked about and were sort of diluted in the conversation to try to make psychedelics fit into the methodological environment that was necessary to convince FDA and regulators that it had some scientific merit. And when they compared and strapped people to beds and did not have nurses' attention and did not have music and did not have any interaction, people didn't do well. And we can all kind of laugh at that and think, well, obviously they weren't going to. But this was where the sort of scientific methodology was at. So I think it's something to bear in mind in terms of lessons that we can take forward as well as we think about psychedelic regulation in the future and some of the doors we have to knock on.
Right, we have to change the therapeutic
So Erika,
protocols.
I just wanted to bring to your attention.
Yeah.
I don't know if you saw it, Erika, but there's a post by Professor David Nutt from London about a 4-part series called Women in Psychedelics.
Yes.
Do you know about that?
I do.
Okay.
I've been in touch with the organizers. We've been focusing on historical pieces, but we want to also keep an eye on this, and we have cross-posted a few things, but thank you. And I'm going to also download this chat because it's so rich. Thank you, everyone.
Well, this is really rich and colorful conversation to be doing in this kind of setting, but I feel like because we've brought about this emphasis on the role of women, I want to really call attention to the fact that the day today began with Bob Jesse making reference to the remarkable and noticeable co-equality between the Shulgins in the work that they did, and their mutual capacity to recognize that they each had a different kind of gift to bring to this work. And because of their ability to merge those gifts and to share them with both each other and with us, I think that's one of the characteristics about their work that makes it so outstanding and unusual. And so I'm very happy that we got to take a little bite out of this today. I understand that the host is going to save the chat. So I don't think that the chat saving feature of Zoom is enabled for this conversation, but the host is going to save the chat, and I hope it'll be available to be posted when the links are posted, or I would be happy to have it delivered to me, and I will extract all the different references to different people and publications that appeared in it, and we'll see if we can put it together to be posted with the links when they do get posted. I do want to, because we're going to be ready to close here in just a few minutes, I want to give each of you an opportunity to give a little summary statement about what's happened for you today. And I wonder if it's possible we could go in the same order that we started. Trout, would you mind to be first, mindful of the fact that we have about 10 minutes altogether?
I've had a wonderful time here. I've learned a lot listening to everybody, and It's been a true pleasure. I'm very thankful for City Lights hosting this and for you moderating this. It's, I don't,
It's always a pleasure to hang out with you, Trout.
likewise. And I mean, one thing that's sort of fun in this is I'm talking about Sasha and Dennis is on the same panel, and I met both of them at the same event in 1993 in Maui.
That's right. That's right.
You're a good storyteller.
Yeah, the Ethnobotanical Preservation Corps.
Yeah.
Yes, yeah. I played hooky from my job at Veda, and I flew out there for that. That was a memorable event, and that was the first time.
Yeah,
Schultes was at that event as well.
Schultes was there, and Albert Hoffman was supposed to be there, but his wife had broken his hip, and he didn't want to leave her. It was amazing.
Yeah, it was. It was a landmark event for sure.
Allan, would you like to say something summative?
Well, just to thank everybody, and thank you very much, Maria, for everything that you brought to this, and me personally, and for all of us. And it was such a treat to talk to the greats, everybody that, except for myself, who was on today. It was phenomenal and very informative and enjoyable. And I felt very happy to be among everybody on the panel. So thank you.
Well, it's nice to be able to appreciate your long history of contributions to this work. I remember when the first publication of Zigzag Zen occurred, and we were still just beginning to emerge from the era of reprehension, and what a tremendously courageous act it was to collect those stories and to get people to tell them. And we had that very enjoyable day at the Spirit Rock, where the meditation hall was standing room only, and very
Packed.
Jolly
400
conversation.
people.
Yep. So you've been at this a long time, and I think you ought to be included in the elders and greats for sure. So thank you very much for appearing here with us.
Maybe elders, not greats. Thank you.
And Dennis, you want to say goodnight?
Sure. Well, Allan, don't underrate yourself. You're an elder and you're one of the greats. So own it, man. I mean, you've been in this game a long time. I just want to thank everybody for this, for Peter and Deborah for organizing this, City Lights Books, Synergetic Press. I mean, this has been a really sweet, enjoyable conversation, kind of like old home week. It's always nice to get on these things and see so many old friends. So it's, like this and the previous one that we had. So this has just been a very sweet and enjoyable interaction. And, I think it's in the spirit of Sasha that Sasha and Ann, both of them, that we're celebrating this. These are the kinds of exchanges that could take place over his, in their kitchen, when people used to stop by and sit around and rap, So yeah, it's been a wonderful event. I really appreciate the privilege of being invited, and I'm looking forward to the next tomorrow. I guess
Thank
we have
you.
3 sessions. So
I want to
you.
give Erika a chance to give a closure, and then I have one of my own. We're almost out of time.
Go for it. I'll shut up.
As I mentioned at the beginning, I'm just truly honored and privileged to be part of this. It's such a rare treat as a historian to be able to come in and think about ways of linking the past with the future. And I think this event is exactly that. Particularly as we embrace the psychedelic renaissance, it is incumbent upon us to now look back at the past with fresh eyes, to think about some of the stories that have been buried, some of them that have been protected, and some of them that exist within your minds. And so bringing these stories forward is just such a treat to witness. And I'm just so grateful to Maria for inviting me to be part of this. So thank you.
You're so welcome. Now that we're coming to the end, I feel like my sense of being careful about not doing too much self-dealing is a little bit lifted. There are a couple of things that are of interest to me personally that I wanted to mention. One of them is that I am going to teach a class in women and psychedelics at the California Institute of Integral Studies this fall. And the other one, even more importantly, is the nonprofit organization that was the brainchild of Ann Harrison, which she and I and Carolyn Garcia founded in 2007, and which is still going strong as a mature organization today. It's called the Women's Visionary Council. We're just about to launch our beautiful new website. And I think that you can look forward to some interesting experiences and the posting of some fruitful, both academic and more social literature and papers on the site. And I would encourage you to look us up, the Women's Visionary Council, and you can find us by any kind of ordinary website, a web search. And then I think I'd like to give just this last few minutes back to Peter, our host, in case he has some enlightenment for us about what to do tomorrow. And please do come and join us at the WVC also.
That was like a very rich meal, such a pleasure, and such a stimulating cross-section of experience. I mean, coming from everybody. Professor Mangini, thank you so much for the way you've just sort of crafted this amazing trajectory that the evening took. Thank you, Allan Badiner. Thank you, Erika, Dyck. Thank you, Dennis, McKenna. Great to see you again. George Greer in absentia. And of course, Keeper Trout. Thank you all for being here. This wraps up the session, but tomorrow's session is going to begin at 12 noon. It is called Currents in Psychedelic Research and Regulation. It will feature Hamilton Morris as moderator, with appearances by Rick Doblin, John Gilmore, Amanda and Cosmo Fielding, Leonard Picard, and Paul Daly. Hope to see you all there. Thank you all again. Be
Can't
well.
wait.
Thank you. Thank
Can't
you.
wait.
Thank you.